Thank you so much for tuning in to Learn Linux TV, your source for Linux-related fun and learning. I love producing Linux-related content for you, but I can't do it alone. If the content on this channel has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting Learn Linux TV. And one of the ways that you could do that is by becoming a patron, which will give you access to exclusive perks. Also, be sure to check out my latest book, Mastering Ubuntu Server 4th Edition. And while you're here, be sure to subscribe. New content is uploaded each and every week. Thank you so much for your support, I really appreciate it. Now, let's get started with today's video. Hello again everyone, and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the process of creating an Ubuntu 22.04 template within Proxmox. And creating a template is a great way to simplify the creation of a virtual machine. Once you have your template set up, you can simply right-click on it, you can clone it, and you could create any number of VMs from that template. It saves a lot of time. Now, if you're a longtime subscriber of Learn Linux TV, you might be thinking, well, Jay's already done videos about creating templates in Proxmox, so why is he covering this again? Well, actually, the method that I use to create templates has changed a little bit, so I figured I would make an updated video to show you guys how I'm creating templates nowadays. Or specifically, I'm actually using an official cloud image of Ubuntu rather than the ISO image, so I'm going to show you that. And also, I'm using Cloud Init as well, so that's another thing that you'll get to see in this video. Anyway, I'm excited to show you guys my new and updated approach when it comes to creating templates within Proxmox, so let's go ahead and dive in. So what I'm going to do first is create a new virtual machine, and this VM in particular will become the template, but we need to have a reference VM to start with. For the VM ID, I'm going to give it ID 900. As you might know, if you've seen my Proxmox series that I have on this channel, you can set the VM ID to any number you'd like as long as it's not actually in use already. But I like to give it a high number for the ID. That'll make it show up lower on the list, but again, you could give it whatever number you'd like. For the node, I'll set that to the second node. You can create it on whatever node you'd like though, doesn't matter. And then for the name, what I'm going to do is call it Ubuntu 22.04 template. Just like the VM ID, you can name it whatever you'd like. You can't use some characters like, periods or underscores, but for the most part, you could just set this to whatever you'd like the name to be. But so far so good. Let's click next. For the OS, this is where we would otherwise select the ISO image that we want to boot from, but what I'm going to do is choose not to use any media. Like I mentioned in the intro, I'm going to be using a cloud image, not an ISO image, so I really don't have any use to attach an ISO image here, so that's why I'm choosing to attach nothing. On the next tab, I'm going to choose Qemu Agent. I always like to make sure that this is checked. Now, keep in mind, the Qemu Agent only works if you actually have it installed, but you may as well check this box. Reason being, if you install the Qemu Agent in the future, then it's already enabled in the virtual machine, so that's one less thing that you have to change later. Let's go to the next tab. And then here we can actually configure the disk for the VM. But actually, I'm going to diverge from my normal process right here, and I'm going to delete the disk. So now we have no disk at all. But without a disk, how are we actually going to use this? Well, I will be adding a disk. I'm just going to go about it a bit differently. So for now, I'll just choose to not have a disk, and we'll create that later. So we'll go on to the next screen. And for the number of disks, I'm just going to leave that at 1. I think that's fine. This is just a template anyway. We can always increase that later. And for the memory, I'm going to lower that down to 1024. Again, it's just a template, so I want that to be the lowest number that I can comfortably set it to. Anything lower than 1024 might be a bit uncomfortable, so I think this is a good minimum right here. Moving on. On the network screen, what we're going to do is choose the network that we want the VM to be on by default. We'll be able to change this later, so it really doesn't matter. But I do like to be consistent, and I do have a dedicated virtual machine network here. In my case, it's VMBR1. On your end, if you only have VMBR0 and no other network, you can go ahead and choose that. There's no problem. But if you do have another network that's dedicated for virtual machines like I do, you may as well select it. Let's go to the next screen here. And we can review the information here, make sure that everything is correct. And I think it looks good enough for me. So I will click Finish. You can see that the virtual machine is being created. And now the name that we've selected for the virtual machine has appeared right here. So actually, we're done with this particular step. Now next, what we're going to do is go to the Hardware tab for the virtual machine. So I will click on the VM right here, and then Hardware. And what I'll do is add the Cloud Init drive. We don't actually have to do that right now, but since we're in the GUI, we may as well. So I'll click on that. And for the storage, I will use local LVM. That's my local storage. And I'll click Add. Now that we have the Cloud Init drive, what we can do is go to the Cloud Init tab, and we can have a little bit of fun with this. So what we'll do is set some default values for the VM. For example, the username. Normally when you install Ubuntu Server, it actually asks you for your username during the process. But with a cloud image, it's not going to ask you anything at all because there's nothing to install. It's already installed. Ubuntu is already installed in the image and ready to go. But the image has Cloud Init built into it, and Cloud Init will read these values and actually make them the case within the VM. So I'll set my username right here, and I'll click OK. DNS domain and DNS servers, I'll leave that alone. For the SSH key, if you have one, then I recommend that you paste it right here in this window. And you know what? That's what I'm going to do. And by doing this, your public key will be present in the virtual machine that you create from the template, which saves you a step. So why not? So we have the SSH key set. Next, we'll click on the network section here. And what I'm going to do is set the VM to DHCP. I actually prefer DHCP for all of my servers. Most people use static IPs, but I like static leases better. They're also known as DHCP reservations, so if you haven't heard the term static lease, then now you know what I mean. And by using DHCP, I can control which VM gets which IP right from my firewall, and like I said, that's how I prefer it. So I'm going to set mine to DHCP, but also you should set this to DHCP even if you do plan on using a static IP, because if you don't set it to DHCP, then your VM will have no network connectivity whatsoever when you create it. So we don't want that. So I'll set it to DHCP. And if we want to set a static IP for it, we can always do that later. So I'll click OK. And I can't believe that I almost forgot to set the password. Without that, then our user account would be useless. We wouldn't even be able to log in. I'll set the password. And I'll click OK. So here we should have everything that we need for Cloud Init. In order to finalize the process, I'll click Regenerate Image. And now we should be good to go on Cloud Init. And that's it for the web GUI, at least for now. Let's switch over to a terminal because there's some commands that we'll need to run. So make sure that you already have access via SSH to your Proxmox server. You could always do this by clicking on the console if you don't have access to SSH right now. But considering that there's some commands that I want to paste, it'll be a lot easier if I use a terminal. So I'll switch to a terminal. So here in the terminal, I'll type SSH, then root. And what I'll be doing is connecting to the same Proxmox node that I created the VM on, which in my case was PVE2. I'll say yes, and I'm logged in instantly. And I wasn't asked for a password or anything like that because I already have an SSH key that's associated with my Proxmox servers. But anyway, I am logged in to PVE2 via SSH, and I'm ready to move on to the next step. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is download the cloud image. And to do that, I'll type wget, and then after wget, I'll type in the URL. But I highly doubt that you have the URL for the cloud image memorized, so we're going to need to find out what that URL is. Back on the web browser, what I can do is open a new tab, and I'll paste in the address right here to the download page. I'll have this URL as well as all of the commands that I'm using in the blog post for this video. The blog post will be linked down in the description below, So if you want to copy and paste the commands into a terminal, you'll be able to do that. Anyway, I'll press enter. And here we have a download page for cloud images, specifically the minimal version for Ubuntu 22.04. I scroll down, we have a .img file right here, and that's what we want to download. So I'll right-click on it, then I'll click Copy Link, and then here in the terminal, I'll paste in that URL, and since I'm using wget, that will enable me to go ahead and download this particular image. Now I don't remember if you have to install wget, so if the wget command comes back as command not found, you can just simply run sudo apt install wget. But anyway, I'll press enter, and now the image is downloading. And it's done. So if I list the storage here, you can see that I have the cloud image here on my local file system. Now, before we go any further, there's a command that I need to run on this virtual machine, and it's one of those standalone commands that we really should run but doesn't really fit into its own section, so I'm just going to get it out of the way right now, and I'll paste it in. And here what we're doing is we're creating a VGA console, and without this, we wouldn't actually see anything on the screen when the VM boots up. You know, when you click on the console within Proxmox, well, without this option being set, you're not going to see anything at all. I'll leave a link in the blog post for the other blog posts that I found online when I was actually experiencing that same problem. That blog post helped me figure it out. It led me to this command right here. So I'm going to give that blog post credit, and I'll put that right in the article. Now, before you press enter though, pay special attention to the VM ID. I set my VM to ID 900, which is what I have here, so in my case, it's correct. If you set your VM ID to anything else, make sure you change that in the command before we go any further. And now that's set. With that out of the way, let's get back to the disk. It's not actually completely ready to use just yet. There's a few things that we'll need to do first. So again, we have our cloud image right there, and the first thing that I'm going to do is rename this particular image. I'm not sure why this is required. It makes no sense to me at all, but it is what it is. We're going to move that file name to a new name. And I'll actually use this opportunity to shorten the name, and I'll give it the extension of .qcow2. Now, shortening the name was not required. I could have left the name as is. The file extension is what's important in this step. For some reason, if I don't rename the file extension to .qcow2, it doesn't work. Again, I don't know why. It is what it is. So I'm going to rename the file to include the .qcow2 extension. But the disk still isn't ready just yet. There's one more command that we'll need to run to condition the disk properly before we actually import it into Proxmox. And because I'm lazy, I'll paste in the command right here. And what I'm doing is I'm going to resize the image. As you can see, I'm setting it to 32 gigabytes. We can see that at the end of this command right here. You can set it to whatever you'd like. You can set it to 16, 8, or whatever you think is appropriate. All of my virtual machines have a minimum of 32 gigs, so I'll set it to 32G in this example. And of course, make sure you actually update the file name in this command right here if you are copying and pasting to whatever you named the file. But anyway, we're all set on that. And now we're actually ready to import this disk into Proxmox. And the command that I've just pasted into the terminal, this one right here, that's the command that's going to do exactly that. But before you press enter, there's a few things that you should actually check here before you actually continue. First of all, we have the VM ID. It's set to 900 again in this case, which is correct for me. On your end, just change that to whatever it's supposed to be. And the same for the file name, change that as well. And then finally, I have local-lvm. That's the local storage on my Proxmox server. Now on your end, yours might not be named local-lvm, especially if you're using ZFS. So what you can do is actually go back to Proxmox. If you don't already know what the name of your local storage happens to be, we have a list of storage volumes right here. And I know this is mine. It has the majority of the extra space here. And by default, you'll probably have local LVM as well if you went along with LVM for your installation. but I know that's the correct one in my case. So the final command looks like this. And the qm command is a Proxmox command. You can actually operate Proxmox from the command line. You don't even need the web GUI. We want to import that disk into VM 900. The image that we want to import is the one that I gave it right here, the one that I have local. And then I have the name of the storage volume that I want to import it into. So I'll press enter. And as you can see, it was able to import the disk. Now let's switch back to the Proxmox console here. And let's go back to our VM. And then if we go to the hardware tab, we have right here an unused disk. This is the disk that we imported right here, but even though we imported it into the virtual machine will not use it unless we tell it to. So for this, I'll click Edit, and we'll click Add to finalize the process of attaching this disk to the virtual machine. But before we do that, if your underlying disk is an SSD, then what I recommend is you click Discard right here, also click Advanced, and then enable SSD emulation. You should only do this if you have an SSD, if that's the storage type that you have for your Proxmox server. That's what I have, so that's what I'll set. So I'll click Add, and here we have the VM disk. And this is the very same cloud image that we've imported earlier. We went ahead and resized it, we attached it to the VM, so the disk is all set and ready to go. Well, almost. Let's click on Options and take a look at the boot order right here. We definitely need to edit that. Because we created this virtual machine initially without a disk, then of course our disk is not even going to be a boot option at all. So if we were to create a template without actually setting the boot order, then we would actually need to configure our VM after we create it to set the boot order every time, so we may as well just do that right in the VM. So what I'll do is I will enable it, and I will drag it to the second position. I like to keep the CD drive as number 1. I mean, I might want to at some point boot from an ISO image for some purpose or another, so it's good to have that option here, even if I really don't think there's a good chance that I'll use it. What's going to happen is it's going to check the virtual CD drive for an OS, or a disk, if you will. And if it doesn't find one, then it's going to move on to the second option here. And the second option is, of course, our cloud image that we've converted into a VM disk. So click OK, and we should be good to go on that. Now, another thing that we might want to actually consider is changing the Start at Boot option. By default, it's set to No. So what that means is that any VM you create from this template will not automatically start up. Now this is completely up to you. You might have virtual machines that you don't want running all the time. If that's the case, then you should probably leave this alone and keep it at No. In my case, I actually do like all of my VMs to start automatically, so I will check this box. Now, with all of that done, that should be it. Now we can finally create our template. So what I'll do is I will right-click right here, and then I'll click Convert to Template. Now, before you click this, be double sure that you've set everything exactly the way you want it. There's just no way to reverse this process, so just take your time, verify all of your settings, and if you're sure that you have everything exactly how you want it, then you can finalize the process and convert it to a template. I'm ready to go on my end, so let's convert it to a template. I'll say yes, and the icon right here should change anytime to show that the process is done, and it just changed. So now we have a VM template. And now that we have the template, let's take a look at the process of creating a new virtual machine with this template. And to do so, I will right-click on it, and then I'll click Clone. That's going to bring up this window right here. You can give the VM an ID. So I'll give it 799 as an example. That should show it right above the actual template itself. And instead of a linked clone, I like to do a full clone. It takes a little bit longer to do that, but it is my preferred way to go. You can actually save some space by setting it up as a linked clone, but I literally never do that. I like to allocate everything all at once. just to be done with it. So I'm going to set it to full clone. And of course, I need to give it a name. So what I'll do is call it Ubuntu Test. I'll click clone. And we can see that the process is starting. Down here in the task window, we can see that it's spinning. And it's already done. That didn't take any time at all. So now we have the virtual machine. And what I should be able to do is right-click on it and start it up. And if I go to the console, we should see it boot up, which is exactly what I'm seeing right now. Now we see a login prompt, but we shouldn't try to log in yet. We want to make sure that Init has actually provisioned our user account first. So you might run into a race condition if you try to log in as your user account, the one that you set up in Init, before it's ready. So we want to make sure that we give it enough time to finish. And right now we actually see some information about the SSH host keys, which for me only shows up when the process is done, so it should be done. So what I'll do is press enter, and that brings me back to the login prompt. I'll type in my username, the one that we set up in the Init drive, and then the password. And now I'm logged in. Another thing that we should check is we could run IPA to see if we have an IP address, which I do. It ends in 205 in my case. If I didn't set the DHCP option, I might not have actually seen an IP address here. So that's a good sign. And then next, what we're going to do is we're actually going to install the Qemu agent. And we could do that by typing sudo apt install qemu-guest-agent. And that should do it. I'll just press enter to accept the defaults here. And now we have the Qemu agent. And at first, it's not actually going to run, and I'll show you what I mean. So if I run systemctl status Qemu guest agent, it's going to show inactive and dead. But all we should have to do is reboot it. So I'll type sudo reboot. And now the machine is already coming back up. So I will go ahead and log in yet again. I'll recall the previous command where I checked the status. As we can see right here, the Qemu agent is actually working. And because we have the Qemu agent, we could do things like this. I could right-click the VM, and I can actually shut it down. I could have done that in the console window, but with the Qemu guest agent, that enables things like this, restarting the instance from the web console. And as you can see, I was able to shut it down. So I think it's safe to say that our new template is working. So there you go. In today's video, we set up a brand new template for Ubuntu 22.04 within Proxmox. I showed you the process of downloading the cloud image for Ubuntu 22.04, importing that into Proxmox, building the template, setting up Init, and then launching a VM from that template. If this video has helped you out, then please consider clicking that like button to let YouTube know that it helped you out, which in turn helps me because it spreads the learning to other people that might also benefit from this knowledge. Anyway, thank you guys so much for checking out this video and subscribing to Learn Linux TV. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you again very soon.